So time to add jQuery mobile jQuery validation plugin into a jQuery mobile design. As our code organized in such a way, we embed all the script tag into index.html page alone, because that's a landing page and that's the only page which has all the wrappers, and rest of the pages is dynamically loaded, pages are dynamically loaded in this particular tag which is just next to the body. So it's in fact helps us to maintain a single code representation, or maybe just in the header itself we can simply add those plugin information, so we are fine. But the problem, here, the jQuery validation plugin should get registered just before the page is ready or the document is ready. But if you notice the design, at this point I don't even have my registration DOM loaded. The registration DOM loads only when I click this plus button or something. So I need to know when this page ready so that I can have my plugin registered so that the validation could be proceeded. So previous example, we had a document ready because the form was pretty static. In the main page itself, the form was there. I could easily use the document ready to identify the form is ready, the plugin could be registered. At this point, it's pretty dynamic. So we have to see how we can deploy or we can register the jQuery plugin or jQuery validation plugin. Okay, this is where the register page comes. I'm going to write a couple of additions. Maybe I'll introduce a function. Function, just a function. I really don't have a form here. That's very important. So let us introduce a form first. Okay, this is where the form, the page starts, the main page container, the main container. This is where the form. So I would prefer to have a form element added before proceeding. Get for testing purpose. We don't have action, maybe blank. Why usually I keep these things mean any form element, at least these two make sense. So without them, I really don't have an idea whether how the form is going to get submitted. So even though it doesn't serve a purpose here, I would recommend at least whenever you introduce a form element, at least try to see what all these two attribute and value could be specified. Okay, the form ends at one point. I hope here. So we just introduced a form. I'd like to keep an ID so that it could register with the jQuery validation plugin. I just make it as a reg form. So at this point, the jQuery plugin should get registered whenever this function is called. I can call this function only when the registration page is loaded. Of course, that's an important point here. So we already have a kind of a listener here, page before change, which keeps tracking which DOM is loading and which particular page is loading. So I do have any block for registration. I really don't see that. We introduce at one point. Okay. What's the name of this particular page? We have given this register. This happens when we suddenly work on Windows for some time and again come back. This guy tracked my voice. Okay. So whenever this particular page, registration page is loaded, I'm going to get this particular block, and this is the right block to have our jQuery validation plugin register. I mean, at this point, jQuery plugin will take control and keep tracking what is happening to your form. But we had to define the rules, but at least we made sure the jQuery plugin could be registered. Uh, of course, in this case, we do not have a document ready function or something like that. Okay. Being a form, we are missing one thing, because right now we've wrapped everything inside a form. A form requires a name attribute. We don't have a single name attribute into our forms, looks like. So let me put them. I'll give the same name. Okay, required stuff we will define it through our rules and messages, so I really don't want to put it here. The control group gender is all pretty optional stuff. Of course, gender by default we have a female selected, so at least the user has to, is forced to select something. So we could very well skip this part, because by default the user is going to select something, and this is an optional one. So whether the user selects or doesn't select, it doesn't matter. So I'm not going to define them over here, even though it has name attribute already given. And we have already have a submit button, but it's an anchor URL, an anchor point, like. But I really want to have a input field behave as a submit button. Okay. For some time, I'll comment it. This will also put a button because the type is submit. First verify. It looks fine. We still have a submit button by this time. Or if such a case you could not see a button type, you can force anything to become a button. For example, you can put a class stating that it's a button. You can tell that. So if you really do not see a something like which doesn't looks like a button, you can force it, add a class attribute and give a value, and of course it's going to behave as a button, because jQuery mobile has extensive CSS which could override the plain design and have that part added. Okay, I'll leave it optional still. Okay, now at one point it's going to be validated. Now time to define the rules. Assuming the jQuery validation has taken control and the rules and messages has to be defined, so I mean those things, based on that it is going to validate and let the user to allow and submit it. In fact, right before it was calling register user, it was saving those username and password in the local storage, and before calling this one we have to make sure we complete the validation. Okay, first one is a rule, and second messages. These two important. Okay, rules. The very first requirement, the username should not be empty, and we'll give some minimum length 3, because I usually give a very small username. So I hope the ID, or sorry, the name, having a ID and the name keeping the same gives me a benefit because IDs are pretty represented always in jQuery and JavaScript side. But when form has to be submitted, it expects a name attribute. So, in fact, having both as the same value or same name helps me not to get confused with. Okay, so of course, inside another object required. And time for its rules. Required, set to true, and min, say 3. And what's the message you'd like to display when this condition does not meet? Anything you can specify. Like that, you can expand. So what we have next, password, and maybe we have a password 2 as well, I hope, which I added lately. This time equal to so it should match with this one. And what else we have? Email. Should be email set to true. First name. Sorry. I would want you to do a little dig on this in the afternoon session. You have to define a rule. You can find in the documentation. I have already shared a link. The first name should not contain numbers. So try to define that rule. But at this point, if you could not, I'll let you know. Okay, minimum length. Okay, that's fine. Okay, the rest of the stuff it's pretty normal. So let me call these two and define its roots. I mean messages. Okay. Okay, we define the rules and messages for this particular form to be validated against. First, we will verify whether these things been honored or not. Then we'll see what has to be done next. If the form gets submitted, I should see the URL changed. But if it doesn't, okay, works pretty well. So these things are validated against. Enter something different, doesn't match. At the rate, okay, I'll enter some. Okay. So at this point, I entered everything. That validation additional message is gone away. It looks like the form is ready, but I have some issues. When I click, the form gets submitted, but this is not the behavior I want. I want the data to be captured and saved into a local storage and then go back to the previous page. That has to be done. But our design change, in fact, forced us to one scenario where I do not even know whether the form is successfully submitted or not. Or I need to know a listener or something which keeps identifying whether the form is submitted or not submitted, so that I'll prevent the default action, so not to submit and capture the values and save it into a local storage. But there is one more easiest way. Remember, I've already added 3 objects inside the validate argument rules, sorry, 2 objects, rules and messages. Inside it has couple of things, but I'm going to add one more. Submit handler. This is a part of JQuery validation plugin. It also has one more object which a value could be defined as a submit handler. This is when will be called when a form is successfully submitted, means the moment you see this transition. So this particular part would be called, and there is one more handler, invalid handler. Whenever the form is having wrong values, and whenever the validation does not pass, this particular block will be called. In fact, it's not an object. I need a function call. I already told you an object can be an instance of a function as well. Or if you have a little confusion, remember these are all the default definition as per the documentation. There is apart from rules and messages, there is 2 more object attributes are also possible. One is submit handler and invalid handler. Submit handler expect a function callback, and of course invalid handler also expect a function callback. It gives me 2 object, I hope. I really don't know, but we'll see that through the console output what exactly it is giving me. The submit handler is going to be called whenever the form is successfully submitted, and it also prevents the form page refresh or something. I'll put a console output. To check whether it is working properly or not. Because the user with having the wrong value, he may still click on the submit button, so we have to prevent the form submit. And of course it is preventing, but if there is any option, we can check whether that such option is happening or not. Going to inspect. First part, I just click submit button. If you notice the form submission failed, it means the validation hasn't passed. The validation is still waiting for some characters to be entered so that it will allow the form to go submit. So that's the reason if you are seeing form submission failed, because this block is called because it had to get passed. So let me enter them. When I click submit, if you see that the page did not refresh, but I got a hook here, form submitted successfully. So I listen whether the form is successfully submitted or not. Because the form is successfully submitted because the values entered are proper, the validation went through, and the form is ready to be submitted. So using here, I'm going to do a couple of work. Of course, time to call this function, because this is the actual submit. Let the user can go ahead and save the values to the local storage. Even though I save only 2 values, I would recommend you modify the code so you will save all the details in the local storage. But for this example, I'm just saving these 2 to see whether I could do it without consuming much time. Okay, looks like everything looks correct. Checking, doesn't work. And submit, we are done. And of course, it's going to work as it is. And here also I would recommend add a validation, because the user should not enter the blank username and password. And everything fine now. Now, I would like to replace this with, instead of back, I want you to put a menu. When the user click on this, a navigation drawer, a slider, or whatever way we saw an example in the previous JQuery mobile plugin, example. It gives me additional 2 links. One is to close or log out. In fact, it is doing the job of logout, and one more link which is called registration, or maybe my account, something like that. Once the user click on this, you bring that registration page again and let the user to edit, modify the password and do something. I want you to add this one, replace this link and put a navigation bar over here. Try that. Of course, time to handle these things independently uh, instead of giving on-screen guidance. Try that, the afternoon session, along with this validation. I want you to add the validation not only here as well. The validation should be added here, because the blank username or the name should not be entered. And of course, we forgot the score or maybe the mark. So that also we put it in this place. So here add the validation, and of course here also add the validation. And once everything goes through, and make sure replace this back button instead of a menu button, and a navigation drawer or menu appears, has it contains 2 links. One is to for logout, another one is to register, or edit the registration page. You may name it as a my account or something like that, so that the user can modify the username and password. And across everything, you should have the validation done. And hereafter, whatever design we are going to create, the validation is going to be there, and we are not going to be quite lenient on let the user to enter the wrong data. We have to filter at any point of time the wrong data does not gets entered into a database or local storage. So the validation hereafter is quite mandatory. And this example, we added a form element and we check whether the form successfully submitted or not. we identify the form submit handler, whether it is detecting the form successful submission, and then we call those function and of course proceed for saving into a local storage. Apart from that, yes, we have rules and messages, and we also have to register the jQuery validation plugin when the particular DOM is ready. The previous case, it was document ready, which was straightforward because the page was static, but in this case uh, the page itself is loaded only when certain action is performed. So I identify when the registration page is loaded and then register my validation plugin, and of course the initial rules and messages along with the submit and invalid handlers, and through which I can proceed. If you have a little difficulty on understanding this part, we may also do one thing. You can define a function in this way. Sorry. You can define an object and call that object if required. This way also you can do it. If you have a little bit of confusion, okay, put everything, load everything into a single line. Sometime you may have a little confusion over putting the curly braces and nesting the block. But whatever it may be, make sure you have a clear idea about what you are really doing and how the object declaration happens in JavaScript. Remember, JavaScript, so everything is everything object. An object, it can be a string, integer, boolean, or primitive type. Of course, an object can be an object of defined through a curly braces, or an array object with in turn the multiple instance of an object be repeated, or it could be an instance of a function as well. So whatever it may be in JavaScript, it's an object. But the validation, remember, three major attributes: rules, messages, and submit handler. If it are required, invalid handler, maybe four, you can take it. Has to be defined, and those things in turn has the initial, I mean the values or rules as an object defined. So these things you have to use in that way. Okay, this is a pretty simple example, and with this we somehow complete the app with all the security setup and everything added. And this example almost covers everything. Like, you know, we see how JavaScript and jQuery put it to use, and we are using jQuery mobile, and we are using event listeners, we are using IndexedDB, we are using local storage, we are using session storage, and of course finally jQuery validation. The whole stuff being added into this single example. So if you could clearly make this one and understand how these things work, you're pretty fine. And of course we can work on some of an advanced topics such as Node.js and other stuff, so that how we could create a server instance and see how we can make this at as a database driven or cloud based one. So that example, since I have a time, probably I'll explain that a little later. So make sure you add this and also complete the requirement what I just told you. Make sure you add the further two buttons in this pages, and of course the whole afternoon session you can complete that, I hope. If you have a difficulty, of course tomorrow, if you could not complete tomorrow, I'll write it on screen. I really don't see that's quite difficult thing. You can very well easily complete that. So afternoon you make sure you complete this thing. I'll upload this source code.